So hello everybody, this is Bante Joe here, and I'm just here at the Dhahatuna Kuti, and thought to record a short Ovada for the internet. So I thought I could start with a little meditation, so I can lean forward a bit and arch the spine, and look about 3 feet in front, and close our eyes. And can focus in on the breath, can know when it's coming in, and know when it's going out. If we breathe in a long breath, can just know I'm breathing in a long breath. And if we breathe in a short breath, can just know I'm breathing in a short breath. And can just pose the question in the mind, what would be a really comfortable way to breathe right now? And just let the body respond on its own. And if the breath feels uncomfortable anywhere, can adjust it, can make it longer, can make it shorter. Can make it heavier, can make it lighter. One can tweak the breath a bit to try to make it as comfortable as possible. And before we finish meditating, can spread thoughts of goodwill, wishing may all beings all around everywhere be happy and at ease. May they put in place the causes necessary to be happy and at ease. And we can make the mind infinite, can make it unbounded, all the way to the ends of the universe and beyond, in every dimension. May all beings all around everywhere be happy and at ease. And can open our eyes and do a short Owada for the internet. Namo Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. So hope that everybody's having a great day wherever it might be. And things are coming along here in Sri Lanka. Actually, I went to visit a doctor yesterday, nothing major. But Sri Lanka is quite an amazing country. When you go into the doctor's office, the first time I went, I remember I was very surprised. Myself and another monk went in, and I think most of the people in the room stood up in the waiting room. So there's an incredible respect for the Buddha and his teachings in the country, and it being an ancient Buddhist country. And we went into the doctor's office that time, and we sat down. And the doctor, it's actually a private clinic, and the doctor kind of met with us and talked. At that time, I think I'd actually been walking in the forest, and I stepped on an old barbed wire fence. So I wanted to go get a tetanus shot. And so he gave us the tetanus medicine free of charge, and then actually gave us more things. He's like, do you need any, I think he was asking, do you need any medicine at the monastery? He gave us more medicine to take back to the monastery. And so the Buddha is often compared to a doctor who treats illnesses. And here the illness isn't physical, the illness is what you might call mental. And there's a difference between the Buddhist conception of mental illness to a certain extent and the conception of mental illness. I'm not sure the modern definitions, but at least when I was growing up, the conception of mental illness. The conception of mental illness, at least the time when I was growing up, was basically that it was something more or less that stopped one from functioning normally in society, basically doing things that were considered normal in society, having a kind of normal job or normal relationships, all these different things that one might normally do. And if one couldn't do them because of some mental blockage, it was considered an illness, a mental illness. And so within that kind of normal framework, there were things, of course it was understood that there would be a certain amount of suffering, a certain amount of pain in a person's normal day-to-day life, and this would be normal. It would be normal to get angry sometimes. It would be normal to maybe feel sadness sometimes, normal to be confused or deluded sometimes. But it's when these things went out of bounds to a degree that one could no longer function. That was when they were considered, or no longer participate normally in everyday life. Then it was at this time that these things were considered to be a kind of illness. And the Buddha's conception of illness, as far as he describes like illnesses in the mind, more or less, is basically any time the mind feels a type of suffering, any time the mind feels a type of they call it like soka parideva domana supayasa. It's kind of like sorrow, or lamentation, kind of like wailing or crying, or kind of depression or feeling sad, or kind of like despair when the depression gets really extreme. So it's all these various kinds of like mental anguish that a person might feel. It's kind of often summed up as basically suffering. Kind of any way the mind feels suffering is the way that the Buddha would categorize a kind of illness. And he says that people can claim to have physical illness for physical health for even 100 years, but that there's basically no one, as far as I remember the sutta, basically no one except arahants can claim to have mental health even for a second. So the standard of kind of what you might call mental health kind of is very high. Basically means when the mind is free of these various things that hinder it, the various kind of things that cause it to suffer. Now the interesting thing is that what one might call mental illness in, say, like a normal Western society, there's some of the things in the Buddhist teachings that might be classified as bad states in a normal Western psychology. So, for example, there's this emotion called samvega. Samvega means this kind of fear and terror at the prospect of being basically reborn again. It's kind of fear and terror at the prospect of having to undergo repeated suffering, more or less. And so in the canon, there's these times when, especially when the Buddha first started to teach, he went to, I think some of his first disciples was a merchant named Yasa. And he was very rich. And I think he, was even kind of, had these various things going on. I think one time, I can't remember the story exactly, but I think one of his wives or something like this, or maybe some female entertainers, he saw them kind of drooling. And he felt like it looked like a charnel ground. He saw them drooling when they were asleep and felt like it maybe even looked like a charnel ground. And he went around saying, this is terrible, this is horrible. And he was walking and he saw the Buddha and he was repeating, this is terrible, this is horrible. And the Buddha said, this isn't terrible, this isn't horrible, speaking about the Dhamma that he'd seen. So this type of suffering that occurs in the mind, it's kind of something that in the Buddhist teaching that one can turn in both ways. So it isn't necessarily just the case that because one feels a type of suffering or one feels a type of distaste or displeasure in the world that it means that there's necessarily something wrong. So the Buddha has this line that that suffering can either lead to bewilderment or search. So basically, if it leads to bewilderment, then it can lead to this incapacitation where one can't do anything. One can't function normally in society. One can't even have normal conversations. Kind of this inability of the mind to function normally. But this emotion, which might also, at least when I was growing up, I don't know now, is also classified as maybe something abnormal. If one didn't find joy and delight in the normal things in the world, if one couldn't see happiness in them and wanted to find a way out. So in ancient India, there was this movement called the Samana Movement, which predated the Buddha somewhat. And apparently it may have came about because people were getting tired of, at the time, there was kind of Brahmin ritualistic religion where they would basically, slaughter animals and do different kinds of pujas, different kinds of like rituals. And these rituals were seen to generate karma, and this karma would take a person to heaven, depending on how many rituals they did. But the Brahmins had a kind of hegemony over these rituals. And so one theory, at least that I read, about what might have happened is that people got tired of this hegemony to a certain extent, and of the claims to these various castes being there. And so they basically left and said, well, we'll do this karma on our own, kind of do it mentally. And so this may have been some of the beginnings of like a Samana movement, kind of trying to find a way to generate this karma on one's own. But it eventually became the case that this was kind of a movement that appealed to people who didn't want to participate in normal society. They didn't see the value in the workaday world. They didn't see the value in searching for money, or searching for wealth, or searching for fame, or searching for any of these things. They saw these things, or were at least suspicious, at least confused, that these things may not lead to a permanent form of happiness. And so they had a kind of higher goal, a kind of higher aspiration, which was to find a form of happiness, or form a way of being that kind of that would end rebirth, that would end a cycle of suffering. So in this way, the Buddha's standard of what he defines as kind of mental health or mental happiness is very high. It's something that that leads, or something that wouldn't have any form of mental suffering at all. So in this way, the forms of suffering that one might experience in the normal search for sensual pleasures are seen as a mental illness by the Buddha, seen as a kind of something lurking in the mind, kind of an inclination of the mind that distorts one's perceptions and causes one again and again to search after things that cause one to suffer. But on the other hand, there's this attitude, there's this cultivation of this emotion of samvega, which, at least when I was growing up, is seen as a mental illness by the world, but by the Buddha is seen as a positive thing, at least cultivated in proper proportions. It's because it's this type of emotion, this type of dissatisfaction with the usual levels of happiness that leads one and turns one's mind to a search for happiness that's higher. And it's this search that can actually lead one to find happiness that's higher. So the Buddha has us contemplate things like impermanence. He has us contemplate things like the foulness of the body. He has us contemplate death. He has us contemplate non-delight in the entire world. And if the only conception that one can have of mental health or mental happiness, maybe a better word, is the conception of mental happiness such that one gets happy when one has external things and is unhappy when one doesn't have them. One is happy when one has a good house or a good car, or one is happy when one has the respect of other people or the adulation of other people. Or one is happy if one's children do well. One is happy if one might have a stable marriage. And these things are, of course, things that can bring a certain amount of happiness. But the Buddha's definition of them is that so long as there's an inclination in the mind that launches out to these things, one actually can't claim to have a type of mental happiness or a mental health. Because so long as those things, there's this kind of desire and attachment for these things, any kind of shaking in them causes shaking in the mind, causes unhappiness in the mind. And so the very things that people's mind launch out to and desire for are the same things that cause them to suffer. So in the Buddha's definition of what suffering is, he goes through and lists these type of suffering. Soka parideva domana supayasa is kind of sorrow, lamentation, kind of like depression and despair. But she says, in brief, the 5 clinging aggregates are suffering. And what this means is that basically anything that one might cling to in the world, anything that one might cling to in one's world of experience to try to attach to it, is something that in the end will cause one to suffer. So thinking about this way, if one thinks about it just kind of not skillfully, is something that can lead to bewilderment. Well, what can I do? One loses one's job, one loses one's wife, one loses one's house, one loses the ability to walk, one loses the ability to speak, one gets old and can no longer do most of the things one wanted to do. It can lead to this bewilderment. And one doesn't even want to think about those things. Doesn't want to think about impermanence, doesn't want to think about death, doesn't want to think about the body, the ugliness of the body, kind of the unattractiveness of the internal organs, because this is the only way that one sometimes can conceive of having any type of happiness. But it's when one sets one's mind to the standards that the Buddha set his mind to. When one sets one's mind to these standards that the Samana set one's mind to, and one basically uses one's imagination, uses one's kind of sense of exploration, that what if there's a way? What if there's types of happiness that are higher than this? What if there's types of happiness that don't depend on sensual pleasure? What if there's types of happiness that don't depend on anything at all, or a type of happiness that doesn't depend on anything at all? And because of this, one generates this desire, I want that type of happiness. And this is where this cultivation, this thinking about these things, this kind of mental illness or mental unrest can lead to a search. And that search can lead to results such that one can come to know or find types of peace or types of happiness that are more stable. Types of peace and types of happiness that don't require the mind to sway when external things change so much. And this is what they call the noble search. This is what they call this is what one can call inclining the mind towards something higher. And this is what one might call inclining the mind towards actually true mental health, towards the type of mental health with the standards that the Buddha had, which is these standards that the mind doesn't have to suffer, doesn't have to shake from sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair at all. But to get there, one has to use these undesired states in a proper way. One has to use the sorrow that comes in one's mind. One has to use the suffering that comes into one's life when the things that one cares about don't work out the way that one wants. One uses these things in the way of investigation. Wait a minute, these things are causing me to suffer. Why is it that they're causing me to suffer? Maybe there's another way. And in this way, one doesn't have to suffer from bewilderment when things change in a way that one doesn't like. One doesn't have to fall into what they might call mental illness, even if one's physical body declines, even if one loses one's house, one's car, even if one loses one's wife or husband, if one's children, things happen to them that one doesn't like. If all these disagreeable, unpleasant things happen in one's life, one doesn't have to become bewildered from them, so long as one is set out on this noble search. And this is a search that leads to happinesses that don't depend on these things, that are higher and more satisfying. And this is a search that in the end, so long as one pursues it, can lead to this true type of mental health, this type of mental health that the Buddha described, where sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair can't touch the mind at all. And this is what he calls Nibana. Okay, so leave that for reflection, and hope that everybody has a great day wherever it might be, and wishing all the blessings of Dhamma practice.